being said, at the same time, really in every instance where a court has held that unless the context otherwise requires, it's because you're dealing with some sort of other thick and robust scheme of regulation where the investor actually is protected. So it might apply, it might not. And in terms of virtual worlds, there is fraud law that might potentially apply within virtual worlds, but it's not really the comprehensive scheme that the courts have referred to in the past when they talk about a comprehensive scheme for purposes of an exception to the definition of an investment contract. We have one case on this issue. Ironically enough, it was with a company called Stock Generation Limited. It was an online game. It was a virtual market, not with Second Life. And the court ultimately concluded that in that particular case that you were dealing with an investment contract and that the federal securities laws apply to virtual worlds. So that raises the question, if we're going to make the assumption that federal securities laws apply to virtual worlds, and even if we're not, what exactly are the problems or the concerns with the fact that we have this sort of uncertain state when it involves federal securities regulation? Well, first off, and most obviously, misapprehension of the risk, meaning that people go online, they think that they're having fun, they think that they're playing games, and ultimately they may not realize the fact that they've started to basically gamble their money in these unregulated markets, or in these markets that haven't previously been the subject of enforcement actions by the SEC, or the subject of a lot of litigation. Secondly, you have concerns about fraud. There's been a lot of debate in the literature as to whether or not it's just the perception that fraud may occur in terms of Second Life, or whether or not fraud actually does occur. That being said, if you are really trying to build a stable market, one of the things that you're interested in is investor confidence. And part of how you end up with investor confidence, both with people willing to initially buy in addition to hold those investments, really is to address the issue or address concerns about fraud. As a third point, there's uncertainty of legal obligations, meaning I probably wouldn't be talking to you on a Friday afternoon if it was clear what would happen in these type of cases. And then finally, market instability. And there's been some fairly interesting empirical work done with these virtual securities markets, basically showing that they behave very similarly to what we saw in the United States. And what I mean by that is initially a lot of confidence. People invest. You know, some of the markets have reached levels where there's been, I don't know, $900,000 worth of money invested in them. And then ultimately the markets crash because somebody realizes, oh my gosh, this is completely online. I may lose my shirt here, and everybody takes their money out of the market. So there definitely is that market instability concern. There are a variety of different approaches that potentially could be taken in terms of regulatory reform when it comes to virtual worlds. First off, we could potentially regulate this under some other regulatory regime. For example, online gambling law would be one option, and there are people out there who will equate the stock market or putting your money in the stock market to be very close to gambling. Beyond that, there's the possibility of promulgating some sort of regulatory exemption from securities laws. This would be beyond just an exemption from registration. It also probably would extend to the anti-fraud provisions. There are concerns about that because definitely if people are misapprehending the risks, simply allowing them after the fact to try and recover through a fraud action where they may have very little idea who they actually were dealing with, means that probably we're going to have a number of people who've invested in these online markets who end up basically without any sort of legal recourse. We could strengthen the end user license agreements in terms of service, which I can tell you, maybe I would enjoy spending a Friday night reading one of those things, but strangely enough, most of my friends who play video games don't really read those things, which may be a surprise to you, but I don't know. Beyond that, potentially we could provide some sort of virtual investor education. The SEC potentially could use virtual securities markets, and especially because they appeal so much to the youth, as a place to provide education about investing and provide education about markets. Beyond that, you can enact investor sophistication requirements that in order to actually enter into games involving some sort of securities market in which money is actually at risk, that you have to have a certain level of income or a sufficient amount of financial acumen. That, of course, raises a number of issues, including cyber travel and people who basically do an in-run around that sort of any sort of gatekeeping or monitoring function that the SEC wants to use in terms of actually enforcing the investor sophistication requirements. And the last on this list is actually one of my pet projects when it comes to federal securities regulation. The notion that when it comes to financial markets, that really patchwork regulation doesn't work. And what I mean by that is that in the vast majority of instances, if not all instances, nations have developed, with the exception of Canada, a federalized system of securities regulation. And the reason for that is that it's been found throughout the years that there are definite flaws to allowing individual jurisdictions within a larger market regulate. You end up with gaps in enforcement. You end up with lack of investor confidence. And it would be an interesting idea, an interesting project to get a group of securities regulators together and try and regulate one of these online markets. Meaning that one of the things that's been said with the most recent global financial crisis, which in part I think can be viewed as a problem with the SEC not wanting to enforce the laws that it possibly should have been more strongly in regards to mortgage-backed securities and other aspects of the securities market. A lot of that was because there was a race to the bottom, or probably to put what actually was happening, and something that I wouldn't actually write in an article, an ambling to the bottom, in which the SEC was willing to slowly ratchet down its laws to a point that they were suboptimal. So one idea would be to at least try out some sort of transnational regulation in these virtual worlds to experiment with it. And there's been lots of good empirical data about how these markets have self-regulated, lots of good empirical data about how these markets have functioned without regulation, and it would give an option. There are definite concerns about that, of course. I mean, with the low capitalization of most of these markets, it might be difficult to get the SEC and other securities regulators to take this seriously. In addition to that, the SEC, at least in the past, has been more interested in looking at inappropriate things on its browsers rather than thinking about online securities games, but maybe that'll change because they have more time. But at least it would be an option for exploring what eventually I think that as a global financial system we'll have to gravitate towards, which is a system of transnational regulation that's definitely more harmonized and centralized than what we have now. Anyway, I think I will leave it at that, and I thank you for your attention.